This is a history of the world's greatest technological failure. But it is not just a tale of disaster. It is a story of a specific, agonizing choice, or rather, a series of deliberate non-choices that transformed preventable engineering defect into an apocalypse. We often remember Chernobyl as the instantaneous cataclysm of April 26, 1986, the product of tired men making fatal mistakes in the dead of night. That is the immediate trigger, the final spark. But the true story, the one that screams the word avoidable into the historical record, began decades earlier, etched into the blueprints of the Soviet nuclear program, hidden behind walls of secrecy and relentless ideological pressure. To understand how Chernobyl could have been avoided, we must pull back the layers, moving far beyond the control room of Unit 4. This is a cold, hard examination of the political, economic, and most critically, the engineering decisions that laid the foundation for disaster. It is a terrifying realization that the catastrophe was not a fluke, but an inevitability built directly into the core design of the reactor itself, a design known to be unstable, yet pushed forward by a system that prioritized cheap electricity and political prestige over human life. If you're fascinated by the deep history and the hidden truths behind the world's most significant moments, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us continue digging into these complex histories and bringing these critical analyses to light. Now, let's begin to uncover the fatal flaw. The setting is Pripyat, a model city built specifically to house the workers of the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. It was a shining testament to Soviet modernity, boasting pristine parks, excellent schools, and a standard of living far superior to the average citizen elsewhere in the Soviet Union. This perfection was a carefully curated illusion, a psychological buffer protecting the population from the cold, terrifying reality of the massive industrial complex just 3 kilometers away. The 4 towering blocks of the Chernobyl plant represented Soviet technological pride. They were RBMK reactors, reactor Bolshoi Mashnosty Cannonly, or a high-power channel-type reactor. These reactors were unique, fundamentally different from the pressurized water reactors, PWRs, used in the West. Their design was revolutionary, economical, and multipurpose. They used ordinary water for cooling and graphite for moderation, allowing continuous refueling of the core without shutting down. This capability was crucial for the Soviet military-industrial complex, as it allowed for the easy and efficient production of weapons-grade plutonium, a fact deeply intertwined with the lack of safety oversight. This duality, producing both civilian electricity and military material, meant that the RBMK reactor design was shielded from the scrutiny that international, purely civilian designs might have faced. Safety was, at best, a secondary concern when compared to production quotas and strategic utility. The core of the avoidability argument rests entirely on one devastating physical characteristic, one choice in the elemental combination of materials: the positive void coefficient. This concept is the single most important piece of technical information required to understand a disaster, and it is a physical manifestation of the choice that should have been avoided at all costs. In a well-designed, stable nuclear reactor, like the Western PWRs, if the water coolant turns to steam, creating a void, the reactor's power output rapidly decreases. This is a fundamental safety mechanism. It's called a negative void coefficient. As the temperature rises, the reaction slows down naturally, essentially applying the brakes. The RBMK, however, behaved oppositely. Because the RBMK used graphite, an incredibly efficient moderator, to sustain the main chain reaction, the cooling water was primarily a coolant and a neutron absorber. If that cooling water boiled away, the absorption of neutrons would decrease dramatically. In essence, the loss of coolant increased the amount of available neutrons. With the graphite still moderating the reaction efficiently, the reactor would suddenly find itself with fewer constraints on the fission process. Therefore, the positive void coefficient meant that the moment the water turned to steam, the moment something started to go wrong, the reactor didn't slow down. It accelerated. The chain reaction became exponentially faster, creating a runaway feedback loop of heat generating more steam, generating more power, generating more heat. It was a system designed to fail violently when pushed past its limits. Nuclear physicists and engineers in the Soviet Union were certainly aware of this dangerous characteristic. It was not a secret discovered after 1986. It was an inherent property of the graphite moderated, low-enriched uranium core. Yet, the choice was made time and time again to proceed with the RBMK design. Why? The primary reasons were resource availability and cost. Graphite was cheap and readily available within the Soviet bloc. Furthermore, the RBMK design allowed the use of lower-enriched uranium fuel, saving the precious, highly enriched material for the military sector. The RBMK was a workhorse of the Soviet energy program, precisely because it was built to meet quotas with readily available domestic resources, not because it was the safest or most robust design. Safety was sacrificed on the altar of economic efficiency and ideological self-sufficiency. This specific, terrifying vulnerability of the RBMK was not theoretical. Years before the catastrophic explosion at Chernobyl, the system had already issued a stark, unmistakable warning. In 1975, the Leningrad nuclear power plant, equipped with RBMK reactors, experienced a partial fuel channel failure. An accident occurred that resulted in a serious localized release of radioactivity into the environment. This incident, while contained through frantic, heroic efforts and immediately shrouded in secrecy, should have been a definitive moment of choice. The engineers and scientists who investigated the Leningrad event understood the implications. They knew that the RBMK was unstable at low power and possessed this dangerously positive void coefficient. They proposed significant, fundamental design changes that would have necessitated either halting the RBMK construction program or implementing hugely expensive modifications. But the choice that changed everything was made by the bureaucracy: suppression and minimal, superficial fixes. The Soviet system, predicated on the absolute success of its technology and the infallibility of its planning, could not afford to admit such a profound failure in its flagship reactor design. Admitting the flaw meant admitting that thousands of megawatts of planned capacity needed to be scrapped or redesigned. It meant admitting the West had a safer design paradigm. Instead of a genuine, comprehensive redesign, the response was a patchwork of administrative procedures. Operators were issued new, stern regulations warning them about low-power operations, essentially attempting to treat a severe design flaw with a simple written warning. The regulations themselves were complex, counterintuitive, and often ignored because they ran contrary to operational efficiency and production demands. The engineers had provided the solution: redesign the reactor. The administrators provided the compromise: write a new manual. The most notorious consequence of the bureaucratic choice was the maintenance of another critical and avoidable flaw: the control rod design. The RBMK utilized graphite control rods to stop the nuclear chain reaction. These rods were essentially long columns of boron carbide, the neutron-absorbing material, attached to a follower section. But the ends of these control rods, the very tips that entered the core first, were made of graphite. The graphite sections were cheaper and helped streamline the mechanism. The seemingly minor detail had catastrophic consequences. When the operators at Chernobyl tried to scram, rapidly shut down the reactor that night by inserting all the control rods simultaneously, the initial result was not a slowdown but a massive power surge. As the graphite tips entered the water channels, they momentarily displaced the neutron-absorbing water before the boron carbide could follow. Because graphite is a moderator, this initial displacement caused a powerful, instantaneous spike in localized reactivity, a final, fatal acceleration. This was the 10-second fuse that blew the reactor apart. The control rod design flaw was known. The engineers who designed it understood the geometry and the physics. It was a compromise, an economic decision made to save material and simplify the mechanism. Had the choice been made to use full-length boron carbide rods, or rods designed specifically to avoid this graphite tip effect, the emergency shutdown mechanism would have worked as intended. The power spike would have been avoided. The resulting steam explosion would not have occurred. So, the disaster at Chernobyl was not just an accident waiting to happen. It was an accident actively cultivated through layers of deliberate choices. The choice to use the positive void coefficient design for economic efficiency, the choice to suppress the findings of the Leningrad incident, and the choice to incorporate the unstable graphite tips into the control rods. These choices, made far from the control room, were the true architects of the explosion. They create a reactor that, under the wrong operating conditions made more likely by the same relentless pressure for output, would not merely be damaged, but would enter a state of guaranteed exponential self-destruction. The mistakes made by the operators on the night of April 26 were the final, tragic steps down a path paved by decades of engineered instability and systemic denial. We are about to delve into the operational context of that fatal night, the specific test that brought this house of cards tumbling down, and the exact moment the control rods sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. Stay with us as we continue this deep historical investigation into the decisions that transform possibility into catastrophe. The story of Chernobyl is not just a story of a catastrophic explosion on a cold April night. It is a story of decades of compromised engineering, ideological rigidity, and a collective unwillingness to acknowledge that the pursuit of efficiency had fatally undermined the fundamental necessity of safety. When we talk about the choice that changed everything, we must look deeply at the Soviet Union's decision to commit its nuclear future to a specific type of machine, the RBMK reactor. This was not the only design available, nor was it the safest, but it was the one best suited to the unique demands and constraints of the centralized Soviet system, a choice driven by geopolitical expediency and internal economic pressures rather than a cautious approach to nuclear physics. The primary nuclear rival to the RBMK, reactor Bolshoi-Mashnasty Cannony, or a high-power channel-type reactor, was a VVR, Vodovodinoy Energetsky reactor, or water-water energy reactor. For those outside the engineering circles, these names simply represent different technologies, but their intrinsic operational philosophies were worlds apart, especially concerning safety. The VVR reactor, similar to most Western designs like the American PWRs, utilized light water as both the coolant and the moderator. In a VVR, the water is kept under immense pressure to prevent boiling, allowing to efficiently slow down the neutrons, moderation, and remove heat cooling. Crucially, the VVR possesses a strong, inherent negative feedback loop. If the core temperature increases too much, the water density decreases, which in turn slows down the rate of fission, a self-regulating braking mechanism built right into the physics. The RBMK, however, was fundamentally different. It was a giant cylinder containing thousands of individual fuel channels. It used light water only as a coolant, which ran through these channels and boiled to create steam for the turbines. The moderator, the substance that slows down neutrons to keep the chain reaction going, was graphite, blocks of pure carbon. This distinction was the original sin of the RBMK design. The use of graphite allowed the reactor to run on cheaper, less enriched uranium, offering massive economic advantages to a resource-constrained Soviet economy that needed to rapidly electrify vast territories. Furthermore, the channel design meant that the reactor could be refueled continuously while operating, a massive bonus for maximizing output and, critically, for Soviet military objectives. This continuous online refueling capability meant that the RBMK could be used for a dual purpose: electricity generation and the production of weapons-grade plutonium. This strategic advantage, the ability to breed military material discreetly, made the RBMK immensely attractive to the Politburo and the Ministry of Media Machine Building, the governmental body overseeing the nuclear weapons program. The RBMK was thus adopted not because it was the safest reactor, but because it was the most versatile, the most powerful in its class, and the most ideologically suited to the Soviet industrial machine capable of mass production and rapid deployment across the Union. But beneath this veneer of engineering prowess and strategic utility lurked a critical, inescapable flaw rooted in its very architecture: the positive void coefficient. This concept is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the Chernobyl story for a non-physicist to grasp, yet it is the single most important factor in understanding the inevitability of the catastrophe. A void refers to a bubble of steam replacing liquid water in the reactor core. In a VVR, if a void occurs, the lack of dense water means less moderation, slowing the reaction. In the RBMK, however, the graphite moderator is entirely separate from the water coolant. The graphite is always there, always moderating, regardless of the coolant state. When the cooling water boiled away, creating steam voids, the dense water that had been absorbing a certain number of neutrons was replaced by steam, which is far less neutron absorbent. Suddenly, more neutrons were available to strike the uranium fuel. Because the graphite was already providing sufficient moderation, this loss of water absorption led to an acceleration of the chain reaction. This is the positive void coefficient. The loss of coolant increases a reactor's power. It is a catastrophic positive feedback loop. The hotter the reactor got, the more steam was produced. The more steam was produced, the less water remained. The less water remained, the faster the reaction accelerated, leading inevitably to an exponential power surge. It was an engineering design that ran contrary to basic nuclear safety principles embraced globally, transforming what should have been a stable system into a highly volatile one when operating outside specific, narrow parameters. Soviet officials and designers, particularly the academician Anatoly Alexandrov, the head of the Kurchatov Institute and a staunch proponent of the RBMK, were aware of this void coefficient issue. They knew the RBMK was inherently unstable at low power levels when the ratio of steam to water became unpredictable. Their solution was not to redesign the core fundamentally, which would have been politically and economically unfeasible, but rather to impose strict operational rules and rely on human compliance. They essentially declared that the reactor would never operate in the dangerous low power zone, mitigating the flaw through administrative decree rather than engineering solution. This reliance on procedural safeguards over physical safeguards proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Compounding the disaster potential was a flawed design of the control rods themselves. Control rods are the primary safety mechanism, inserted into the core to absorb neutrons and shut down the fission reaction. They are the ultimate brake. The control rods used in the RBMK were made of boron carbide, a highly effective neutron absorber. However, in an effort to maximize the efficiency of the reactor and allow more of the core to generate power, Soviet engineers adopted a highly controversial feature: graphite displacers fixed to the tips of the control rods. When a control rod was fully withdrawn from the core during normal operation, the gap it left was filled by a 4.5-meter column of water. To avoid wasting the space occupied by the neutron-absorbing control rod, when it was withdrawn, the engineers placed a section of graphite, about 4 feet long, at the bottom of the rod. The logic was simple. When the rod was fully pulled out, the graphite displacer would sit precisely in the position the boron absorber had just left, displacing the neutron-absorbing water and slightly boosting the efficiency of the reactor. This small, seemingly benign engineering detail transformed the emergency shutdown system, known as AZ-5, from a reliable safety brake into a potential trigger for disaster. When the AZ-5 button was pressed, the control rods began to drop into the core. But before the neutron-absorbing boron carbide reached the active zone, the graphite tip had to pass through. For the initial seconds of the insertion, the graphite tip displaced the neutron-absorbing water below it, in a heavily voided low-power core. The very condition the reactor was in just before the explosion, this displacement briefly introduced a massive, localized surge of reactivity. It was terrifyingly like pressing the brake pedal and getting a brief, sudden burst of acceleration before the brakes finally engaged. This flaw meant that the moment the operators tried to shut down the reactor to stop the escalating power, they inadvertently initiated the final, critical power spike that caused a catastrophic steam explosion. This design quirk was known internally. It was documented. It was whispered about among reactor physicists who understood the precarious dance the RBMK performed on the knife edge of stability. Yet, the official stance maintained that the reactor was safe. Secrecy and systemic denial ensured that this critical vulnerability was never adequately addressed, and certainly never disclosed to the operating staff at places like Chernobyl. The choice to utilize these flawed rods, motivated by minor gains in neutron economy, represented a deliberate acceptance of risk, prioritizing efficiency and power output over the absolute guarantee of safety. This small design detail alone constitutes one of the most significant choices that ultimately dictated the scale and suddenness of the catastrophe. The awareness of the RBMK's inherent instability was cemented years before 1986. The most famous and chilling example of a near miss involved the Leningrad nuclear power plant, specifically Unit 1, in November of 1975. During a routine shutdown operation, a sudden surge of power occurred, cracking pressure channels and damaging the core. This was a smaller, less destructive version of the exact sequence of events that would later destroy Chernobyl. The incident was investigated, and the resulting internal report confirmed the dangers of the positive void coefficient and specifically identified the control rod design as a compounding factor that could create localized spikes in reactivity. However, in the deeply centralized and ideologically driven Soviet scientific community, the response was not to halt construction of RBMK units or issue a public warning. The choice was concealment. The findings were immediately classified as top secret, buried within the archives of the Ministry of Media Machine Building. A few minor procedural fixes were introduced, changes that were deemed adequate to manage the risk, but did nothing to address the fundamental underlying physics flaw. The operating manual for the RBMK was updated. But critically, the operators were never given the scientific understanding or the full context as to why these new restrictions existed. The technicians at the plants knew that low power was restricted, but they did not know that violating that restriction could lead to an exponential, self-accelerating chain reaction, made worse by the very button they were supposed to press for safety. The political choice made after the Leningrad incident was monumental: silence and denial over systemic reform. By classifying the vulnerability, the Soviet state chose to prioritize the image of its nuclear program, the shining beacon of technological prowess, over the lives of its future workers and surrounding populace. Had that choice been different, had the warnings been shared, had the control rods been redesigned, had the RBMK been permanently restricted to its known stable operating zone, or even scrapped in favor of the safer VVR, the sequence of events that began on April 26, 1986, would have been scientifically impossible. The path to disaster was paved not with ignorance, but with verified, documented knowledge that was deliberately suppressed for reasons of pride, economy, and ideology. It is within this oppression that we find the true tragedy of the choices made. The air inside the control room of reactor number 4 on the night of the 26th of April, 1986, was thick, not just with a stale smell of sweat and cigarettes, but with a palpable tension rooted in deep operational uncertainty. They were far past the point of routine. The series of missteps, delays, and organizational pressures had led them into a territory few operational engineers would ever voluntarily enter, attempting to conduct a crucial stability test on a nuclear reactor operating at dangerously low power levels, a state technically prohibited by the reactor's own safety procedures. This environment was a crucible in which the choice that changed everything was forged, not as a singular, dramatic flick of a switch, but as a compounding series of deliberate violations driven by a desperate need to complete an assigned task. The central technical struggle that defined those critical hours was the fight against xenon poisoning. Earlier, during the preliminary maneuvers, the reactor power had plummeted to an alarmingly low level, dipping well below the mandated minimum operational power of 700 megawatts thermal, a threshold designed to maintain stability and control over the fission process. When the power dropped, the natural processes of nuclear decay took over in a way that worked directly against the operator's efforts. Specifically, iodine-135, a byproduct of uranium fission, was decaying rapidly into xenon-135. Xenon-135 is a potent neutron absorber, what scientists call a nuclear poison. In a normal, high-power reactor state, the continuous stream of neutrons burns off the xenon almost as quickly as is produced, maintaining a balance. But operating at 30 megawatts, the neutron flux was simply too low to overcome the Say-135 buildup. The result was that the core was rapidly becoming poisoned or dosed with xenon, which aggressively soaked up the few neutrons available, driving the reactivity down further and making it extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to raise the power back up to the required 700 megawatt level. The reactor, in essence, was trying to shut itself down. The operators, specifically Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, and the shift supervisor Alexander Akimov, along with Leonid Topchinov, the senior reactor control engineer, faced a critical decision point mandated by the safety protocols: abort the test and allow the reactor to fully poison itself and cool down for a recovery cycled up to 24 hours. This was the safe, necessary, and prescribed choice. Yet, this was the moment where the internal culture of Soviet industrial management collided violently with physics. Aborting the test was politically and professionally unthinkable. The turbine test had already been delayed significantly. disrupting the schedule of the entire power plant complex and causing inconvenience to other sectors of the energy grid. To admit failure now meant not only professional embarrassment, but likely severe reprimands, potentially affecting careers. The pressure from Dyatlov, an uncompromising figure who viewed adherence to safety limits as bureaucratic weakness rather than essential protection, was immense. His authority was not just hierarchical, but derived from the deep-seated Soviet engineering ethos that believed human ingenuity and brute force control could always overcome technical obstacles. This mindset led directly to the critical violation. The decision to proceed with the test, irrespective of the core's poisoned state. To fight the xenon, the operators began systematically withdrawing control rods. The control rods, typically made of boron carbide, are the primary mechanism for absorbing neutrons and regulating the reactor's power. By pulling them out, the operators flooded the core with neutrons, attempting to force the fission chain reaction to sustain itself against the xenon's poisoning effect. This action was a direct, fatal defiance of the operational limits, which strictly dictated the minimum number of control rods that must remain inserted into the core at all times, a vital safety margin known as the operational reactivity margin, or ORM. As the operators wrestled with the controls, the xenon continued its work, demanding more and more control rod removal just to keep the reactor from dying completely. One of the most terrifying indicators of the danger they faced was the position of the rod indicators. The numbers showing how many equivalent control rods remained in the core shrank dangerously low. The official limit required no fewer than 28 effective control rods to be inserted. The operational team, under pressure, ignored this limit, withdrawing rods until the effective number remaining in the core was somewhere between 6 and 8, a margin so thin it was virtually non-existent. This was the technical equivalent of removing the floorboards while standing on the roof. They had voluntarily dismantled their primary safety net, betting that they could manage the reactor manually. This choice, the willful disregard of the ORM, was a pivotal move that rendered the subsequent catastrophe inevitable. They had traded safety for schedule, stability for stubbornness. Furthermore, the personnel made a second, incredibly dangerous choice tied directly to the nature of the test itself. They manually blocked the automatic scram, or AZ5 signal, which was an emergency shutdown mechanism. They did this because they anticipated that the reactor would become unstable during the test, leading to automatic shutdowns that would interrupt the procedure. To ensure the test could be completed without interruption, they bypassed the very system designed to save them from catastrophic power excursions. The Emergency Core Cooling System, ECCS, was also taken out of service, a standard but risky procedure during such turbine tests, meant to prevent the ECCS from flooding the core with cold water if a turbine trip occurred, which would potentially damage the equipment being tested. In this already compromised state, operating far below power with virtually no safety margin, they were relying entirely on their ability to manually manage a highly unstable, poison reactor. The reactor itself, the infamous RBMK-1000, had inherent design flaws that magnified the danger of these operational choices. One of the most crucial and least understood factors at the time was the positive void coefficient. Simply put, most Western design reactors use water not only as a coolant, but also as a moderator, slowing down neutrons. If the water turns to steam, the loss of the moderator slows the reaction down. The RBMK, however, used graphite blocks as the primary moderator and water only as a coolant. When the water in the cooling channels turned rapidly to steam, forming voids, the steam absorbed fewer neutrons in the water, leaving more neutrons available to hit the graphite and cause further fission. In a chain reaction, this meant that a rapid increase in steam bubbles, voids, caused a rapid exponential increase in reactivity and power, a dangerous positive feedback loop. This positive void coefficient meant that operating the reactor at low power was incredibly risky. If any local disturbance caused rapid boiling, the result was an uncontrolled power surge. By the time the operators had wrestled the core into necessary unstable configuration for the test, with maximum xenon poisoning and minimal control rod margin, they had amplified the RBMK's inherent design flaws to their maximum destructive potential. The final, deeply cynical technical flaw lay within control rods themselves. Because the RBMK design used graphite as the main moderator, The control rods were designed with tips made of graphite, not boron carbide. The boron carbide section that absorbed neutrons was positioned above the graphite tip. The purpose of the graphite tip was to displace water as the rod began to insert into the core, thus preventing the insertion of the rod from initially disrupting the neutron flux too severely. However, in the highly unstable, low-power state the operators had created, this design was catastrophic. When the emergency shutdown button, the AZ-5, was finally pressed, minutes after the test was initiated and power began its initial, terrifying rise, the graphite tips entered the bottom of the core first. For the first few seconds, instead of absorbing neutrons and shutting down the reaction, the graphite tips effectively displaced water, temporarily acting as a positive reactivity insertion, concentrating the power increase at the bottom of the core. This critical 2 to 3 second power spike, caused by the very safety mechanism intended to prevent disaster, was a final, irreversible trigger. It was a choice of a flawed design, exacerbated by the operational choices of desperate men, that doomed the reactor. The sequence of operational failures was complete. Violating the minimum power limit, ignoring the required control rod safety margin, and bypassing the automatic shutdown system. These decisions were not made in ignorance of dangers, but in defiance of them, under the false confidence that the operators could tame a physics-defying beast they themselves had created. The minutes between 1:23 and 1:24 a.m. were not just a test of the turbine's capacity to spin down, but final, fatal test of the judgment and authority within the Chernobyl plant, a test that exposed the devastating consequences of prioritizing bureaucracy and output over the fundamental laws of nuclear physics. They had set the stage for an explosive power transit that the RBMK reactor, especially in its current state, had absolutely no mechanism to survive. The reactor was already leaning precariously. The graphite tips merely provided the final, fatal push. The fateful night of April 26, 1986, was not characterized by a sudden, inexplicable disaster, but rather by a slow, agonizing slide down a slope paved with procedural violations, profound ignorance of the reactor's inherent instabilities, and a crushing authoritative ego. We have detailed the design flaws, the political denial, and the ill-conceived nature of the planned safety test. Now, we must examine the final excruciating hours, where the convergence of these factors produced a perfect storm that remains unparalleled in technological history. As the clock crept past 1 o'clock in the morning, the operational crew, led by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, was already operating in a state of deep technical jeopardy. The power level had fallen far below the safe limit of 700 megawatts thermal, plummeting instead to the abysmal range of 30 megawatts. This drop was not merely inconvenient. It was catastrophic from a physics standpoint. The RBMK reactor, especially at low power, is a beast that demands careful and conservative handling. When the water flow through the core remains high while the power output drops, the core temperature falls, which in turn leads to a critical buildup of xenon-135. Xenon-135 is sometimes referred to as the nuclear poison. It is a byproduct of fission, specifically iodine-135 decay, and it acts as an extremely efficient absorber of neutrons. In a normally powered reactor, the high neutron flux burns away this xenon almost as fast as is created, maintaining a balance. But when the power suddenly drops, the production of xenon-135 continues unabated, while the consumption of it drastically decreases. The core begins to poison itself, sucking up the neutrons required to sustain the chain reaction. This poisoning effect presented Dyatlov and the crew with a severe dilemma. The reactor was rapidly losing reactivity, meaning they were losing control over the fission process. Their planned test required the reactor to be operating at a stable level of around 200 megawatts. To achieve this, they needed to overwhelm the xenon. The only way they knew how was to manually withdraw the control rods, increasing the available reactivity far beyond any permissible limit. This decision was not made under duress of an emergency. It was made under the duress of having to complete the test. The political pressure to finish the experiment, which had already been delayed by the day's shift, was palpable. Dyatlov was the embodiment of this pressure, a demanding, rigid, and ultimately dangerous supervisor who enforces will through fear. Operators Akimov and Topchinov, the youngest and most inexperienced in senior positions at night, were caught between following procedure, which mandated shutting down the reactor immediately after the power fell so low, and following Dyatlov's explicit and furious orders to restore power. The immediate consequence of their attempt to raise power was a wholesale overriding of critical safety systems. As the reactor struggled against the poisoning, the automatic protection systems repeatedly attempted to shut it down, signaling the instability. These systems were designed to trip the reactor if power dipped too low, or if the flow rates, temperature, or pressure deviated too widely. One by one, Dyatlov ordered these alarms and trips bypassed or temporarily disabled. This was a conscious, deliberate choice to fly blind, prioritizing completion of an outdated test over the very real danger signs flashing across the control room panel. They disabled the Emergency Core Cooling System, or ECCS, which would have automatically flooded the core with water in the event of a rapid loss of coolant. They did this specifically because the test involved running down the turbine, and the ECCS would have prematurely interrupted the process. The logic was circular and horrifying. They disabled the one system designed to protect them from the consequences of their experiment, specifically so they could perform the experiment. The single most critical technical violation committed that night was the breach of the Minimum Operational Reactivity Margin, or MWAR. This technical specification dictates the minimum number of control rods that must remain fully inserted into the core at all times to ensure nuclear stability and manage the positive void coefficient inherent in the RBMK design. Soviet regulations mandated that at least 30 affected control rods must remain in the core at all times. This number was a crucial buffer against instability. To fight the xenon poisoning and push the power back up, the operators began methodically withdrawing control rods. As they pulled them out, the core's reactivity margin shrank dangerously. The reactor's computer system, called Scala, which monitored the core conditions, desperately attempted to warn the operators. It calculated the effective rod margin and produced printouts that indicated the reactor was in a state of extreme peril. The historical record indicates that the operators, likely following Dyatlov's direct instruction, effectively ignored these printouts. They were so intent on regaining power that they pulled rod after rod out of the core until, by approximately 1:22 a.m., the reactor had fewer than 6 affected control rods remaining. Some estimates place the number even lower, possibly as few as 3 or 4. The vast, cylindrical core, the size of a small building, was being moderated by only a handful of rods. This was not just a violation. It was an act of technical suicide. They had stripped the reactor of its stability buffers, leaving it entirely vulnerable to the RBMK's most devastating flaw, the positive void coefficient. With so few rods inserted, the inherent safety margin against steam void formation vanished entirely. If steam bubbles, voids, formed in the coolant channels, the reaction would accelerate rather than slow down, which is the exact opposite of how a safer, Western-designed light water reactor operates. By operating with virtually no rods, the operators had maximized this deadly positive feedback loop. They had created a scenario where any minor perturbation, any small increase in steam, would be instantly translated into a major power surge. The psychological state in the control room must have been a crucible of stress, fatigue, and denial. Topchinov, the young senior reactor control engineer, likely felt immense anxiety. He had voiced concerns earlier about the low power, but Dyatlov's response was reportedly brutal, threatening dismissal if the test was not performed immediately. This atmosphere of fear meant that warnings were suppressed and critical analysis was replaced by blind obedience. At 1:23 a.m., the test officially began. The operators initiated the procedure to shut down the main turbine, which would force the reactor to rely on the residual rotational energy of the turbine to power the main circulating pumps. This was the critical component of the experiment, proving that the residual energy could supply power during the crucial seconds before the diesel generators kicked in. However, because the reactor was already starved of neutrons due to xenon poisoning and running with an impossibly low rod count, the minute the turbine began to slow, the flow of water through the core decreased marginally. This small reduction in flow, coupled with the instability caused by the positive void coefficient and the lack of inserted control rods, caused the cooling water to heat up slightly more than intended. This increased temperature resulted in the formation of localized steam bubbles, voids, in the lower channels of the reactor core. It was this initial formation of steam that served as the trigger. The RBMK reactor, now devoid of its safety margin, responded precisely as its design intended, catastrophically. The steam bubbles displaced the water, and since water in the RBMK acts as a neutron absorber, removing the water increased the local reaction rate exponentially. This localized increase in power created more steam, which in turn accelerated the power even further. This was a runaway reaction they had unknowingly prepared. The operators watched in horror as the power output began to spike on their instruments. It was no longer a gradual rise. It was an exponential leap. Akimov, recognizing the gravity of the situation that had escalated beyond their control, shouted an order to initiate the AZ-5 button. The AZ-5, or Rapid Emergency Protection System, was the final, desperate attempt to shut down the reactor by slamming all control rods back into the core. It was a final, tragic choice that sealed the fate of the reactor. The AZ-5 button was meant to be the savior, the ultimate safety measure. Instead, due to the RBMK's inherently flawed design, a flaw that was known but ignored by the designers and the regulating bodies, the AZ-5 initiated the terminal destruction of the core. The control rods in the RBMK had tips made of graphite. Graphite is a neutron moderator, meaning it accelerates the reaction, while the boron carbide sections of the rod, meant to absorb neutrons, lag behind the tip. When the AZ-5 was pushed, these graphite tips first entered the bottom of the core, displacing the remaining cooling water. In the most critical neutron-starved section of the core, this sudden injection of graphite caused an intense, localized surge of reactivity. It was a massive, instantaneous power spike in the lower region of the core, estimated to be equivalent to 10 times the reactor's maximum operational capacity. This was not a power excursion. It was a physical hammer blow delivered to the nuclear material. This massive power surge instantly vaporized the remaining cooling water into superheated steam. The pressure inside the core channels shot up with unimaginable force. The reactor, structurally, could not contain this pressure. The initial explosion was not nuclear. It was a violent steam blast, ripping the 1,000-ton upper biological shield, known as the upper plate or ELENA, clean off its moorings. That immense shield was flung into the air, tearing apart the reactor's fuel channels and scattering highly radioactive components across the reactor hull. The seal of containment was broken. The choice had been made. The rods were dropped, and the 25th of April had ended in fiery, radioactive destruction. This catastrophic sequence, the xenon poisoning, the deliberate disabling of safety systems, the violation of the minimum operational reactivity margin, and the fatal design flaw of the AZ-5 system, demonstrate a chain of errors so interconnected that dissecting them reveals layers upon layers of negligence. The choice to ignore the warnings, the choice to prioritize the test over safety, the choice made decades earlier to approve the RBMK design without addressing the positive void coefficient and the graphite tips, all culminated in the deafening rupture of Reactor 4, unleashing the contents of its core into the cold Ukrainian sky. The consequences of this cascade of poor judgment were instantaneous, but the human cost would only begin to unfold in the desperate, heroic, and often misguided hours that followed. We are left with a chilling understanding that every stage of this disaster, from initial design to final execution, presented a clear, avoidable opportunity for a different, safer outcome. The devastating conclusion of April 26, 1986, was not an isolated burst of energy. It was a terminal punctuation mark on a decades-long narrative of institutional failure, political obstinacy, and scientific hubris. We have traced a sequence of events, identifying a moment when the possibility of prevention slipped into the abyss of inevitability. The choice that changed everything, the choice to prioritize expediency and political image over foundational safety, had finally exacted its ultimate price. In the early hours, in the control room of Reactor No. 4, Anatoly Dyatlov, Alexander Akimov, and Leonid Topchinov were enacting the final, fatal scene of a tragedy written long ago in the drafts of the RBMK design. When Akimov finally pressed the AZ-5 button, the emergency shut down, he believed, with the diminishing faith of an exhausted man, that he was engaging the safety system. This was the last technical choice made by the operating team, the choice meant to save the reactor from itself. But due to the inherent, deeply hidden flaws in the RBMK control rod tips, the graphite displacement effect, The safety system became the trigger. The momentary insertion of the graphite followers into the core, designed to push water out and allow the neutron-absorbing boron carbide rods to follow, instead caused an immediate, explosive surge in reactivity. This was a fatal, built-in surprise, the ticking time bomb concealed by years of Soviet secrecy. It was a design flaw known to a select few in the scientific elite of Moscow, but utterly unknown to the operators whose fingers were literally on the switch. This lack of transparency, the willful choice to conceal critical operational knowledge, transformed a difficult, stressful test into an immediate, unstoppable catastrophe. The initial power excursion was so rapid, rising from dangerously high levels to astronomical, supercritical levels in less than 4.9 seconds, that nothing could have stopped the resulting steam explosion. The force was immense, instantaneously vaporizing thousands of gallons of water and slamming the 2,000-ton upper biological shield, known chillingly as Elena, upward. The first explosion was purely steam-driven, rupturing every pressure channel and exposing the nuclear heart of the Soviet Union to the air. Moments later, a second, more powerful explosion occurred, likely fueled by the reaction between superheated zirconium and water, and possibly by a nascent nuclear excursion, violently throwing graphite and highly radioactive fuel fragments high into the night sky. The reactor, the very core of Soviet technological pride, was physically destroyed. The choice to use graphite as a moderator and light water as a coolant, the defining, cost-saving choice of the RBMK, ensured that the resulting fire was not just a heat release, but a burning inferno of highly reactive material. The graphite fire, roared with the intensity of 1,000 suns, propelled an unprecedented plume of radioactive isotopes, cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90, high into the atmosphere, ensuring the disaster was not local, but continental. This final, irreversible moment, the annihilation of Reactor 4, was a consequence of choices made years earlier in comfortable bureaucratic offices. The disaster was not merely caused by the tired, pressured men in the control room. They were merely the final actors forced to play a poorly written script. The true culpability lies higher up the chain. The primary choice that doomed Chernobyl was the selection and subsequent protection of the RBMK design itself. Driven by the need for dual-purpose reactors, power generation, and plutonium production for nuclear weapons, and the Soviet insistence on using natural uranium, avoiding expensive enrichment facilities, the RBMK was a Frankenstein's monster of engineering compromises. Its positive void coefficient, a feature universally shunned in Western reactor designs because it makes the reactor inherently unstable when coolant is lost, was known and systematically downplayed by the chief designer, Nikolai Dolezal, and the political overseers who championed cost-effectiveness over safety margins. The choice to conceal this positive void coefficient from operators, classifying it as a state secret, was perhaps the most morally negligent decision. The technical reports detailing the catastrophic failure mode were filed away, ensuring that personnel like Dyatlov, Akimov, and Topchinov were operating a machine they could not truly understand, let alone respect its deadly idiosyncrasies. When they performed the test, they were walking blindly into a structural trap they didn't know existed, compelled by a culture that demanded obedience to the schedule and minimized fear of the unknown. Beyond the engineering and operational failures, the choice that compounded the disaster and prolonged the suffering was a political decision to deny and obfuscate. For almost 36 hours following the explosion, the Soviet leadership, informed but paralyzed by ideology, chose silence. The local party bosses, led by Viktor Brukhanov, opted for minimizing the incident, fearing the political fallout more than the actual fallout. This choice delayed evacuation, exposing hundreds of thousands of residents, particularly the 25,000 inhabitants of Pripyat, to dangerous doses of radiation. The choice of secrecy extended beyond internal borders. It was the independent detection of unusual radiation levels at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, hundreds of miles away, that ultimately forced the Soviet admission. This choice to prioritize the appearance of Soviet infallibility over the immediate health and safety of their own citizens, and indeed the entire European continent, solidified Chernobyl's legacy as a disaster of systematic dishonesty. The global implications stemming from this specific, avoidable catastrophe were vast and permanent. Chernobyl forced a radical and painful reassessment of nuclear energy safety protocols worldwide. Prior to 1986, the concept of a maximum credible accident often excluded total reactor destruction. Chernobyl demonstrated that not only was total destruction possible, but that institutional secrecy and poor management could turn even manageable scenarios into global threats. Following the disaster, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, underwent a profound transformation. The choice to collaborate, to share data, and to mandate stricter independent oversight became imperative. The Soviet Union was forced to release previously classified data on the RBMK, and the world learned about the reactor's inherent instabilities. This compelled immediate modifications to the 17 remaining RBMK units. Modifications that addressed the flawed control rods and increased the minimum number of rods in the core, effectively stripping the positive void coefficient of its most dangerous potential. These modifications, belated though they were, represent a direct admission that the original design was fundamentally unsafe, a fact previously suppressed. The choice of the Soviet leadership, particularly Mikhail Gorbachev, to finally embrace a degree of glasnost openness regarding catastrophe, however limited and late, signaled the beginning of the end for the Iron Curtain. Chernobyl was not merely a nuclear accident. It was a devastating indictment of the Soviet system itself, a system built on lies, fear, and the suppression of critical thought. The tremendous economic and human costs of the cleanup, the deployment of 500,000 liquidators, the loss of agricultural land, the mass internal migration, shattered the already tenuous Soviet economy. The choice to build a reactor designed for speed and cost, rather than robustness and safety, led directly to a crisis that accelerated the collapse of one of the world's two superpowers. It redefined how nations view technological risk, emphasizing that technology is only as safe as the human systems governing it. Ultimately, the lesson of Chernobyl is not about the uncontrollable power of the atom, but the controllable fragility of human judgment. The disaster was not the consequence of fate or chance. It was the inevitable endpoint of a deliberate sequence of choices. The choice to design a flawed reactor, the choice to conceal the flaws, the choice to mandate dangerously unstable testing, and the choice to deny the crisis afterward. Every step of the way, there was an off-ramp, a moment where a different choice, a choice rooted in scientific integrity, transparency, and human safety, could have averted the climax. Had the scientific establishment chosen to be honest about the positive void coefficient, had the political apparatus chosen international standards over national pride, had the operators been properly informed about the instability of their machine below 70% power, the explosion of April 26, 1986, would never have occurred. Chernobyl remains a most chilling reminder that technological progress, without rigorous ethical oversight and institutional transparency, is a perilous illusion. The shadow cast by Reactor 4 is a permanent monument to the disastrous results of prioritized secrecy. The world learned at tremendous cost that when science becomes subservient to politics, the consequences can be catastrophic and continental in scope. The choice that changed everything was the choice to lie, and the ensuing explosion was simply the truth catching up. We hope this exploration into the true avoidable nature of the Chernobyl disaster has been both informative and deeply thought-provoking. If the facts and analysis presented here have shed new light on this pivotal moment in history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to investigate and share these crucial historical narratives. Thank you for watching.